Good evening, everyone. This is Emily Lochner. We're excited to have you here on our very last call of the inaugural steer profitability competition year. So we're excited that you all have joined us tonight. Tonight, Chip and I are just basically going to walk you through, primarily Chip more than me, just a recap of the year, what you can expect with your steers, and the checks that you may receive, just kind of some premiums and some docks and basic beef yields and quality grading. And so also, as soon as he gets on, if he's not already on, Billy Hall with Chappell Feeders is going to kind of give us an update on when the steers are getting shipped and what the status of that looks like. But I don't believe Billy's on at the moment, so we'll just add him in whenever he gets on. So without further ado, I am going to pass it over to Chip, and Chip's going to give us our presentation for the night. So Chip, have at it.
All righty. Again, to echo Emily's comments, thank you. Billy, when he joins us, he's going to chime in. Otherwise, we'll just move forward. So this evening, we're really going to try to highlight what's the end game, what's the process that wraps up all of your efforts and time in getting your steers both to the yard and the time that they spent there. What's the end game and what that looks like? So we're going to go through two quick talks. One is essentially the basics of the harvesting process at a packing plant. It is not too graphic. You don't have to worry about any of that, but it's going to give you a sense of the step-by-step process for you to know. So we're just going to run through those, and I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to a former colleague and a dear friend and an individual who helped actually start the steer profitability competition, Dr. Brian Wiegand, who is a faculty member at the University of Missouri and was in the onset of this program, and he helped with a number of these slides this evening. And so many of you might know him, might tell him things. So let's go through this process. So your cattle in the very near future, and I'll hold water on specific dates in case Billy joins us, will be going to a packing plant. Again, those cattle will be going to the northern portion of Colorado, where they would be harvested. So the process that they're going to go through, so we want you to be able to see that. So these are the steps that happen at a packing plant. And so we'll go through these one by one so that you can see those on the screen. These are the steps. If you have specific questions, just ask me, and we'll go from there. I just got acknowledgement from aforementioned Billy Hall that he's on the phone call right now. Billy, is that accurate?
Yep, I just got on, Chip.
Awesome. Well, I'll tell you what, before we get into this conversation to make effective use of Mr. Hall's time, one more time we'll introduce Mr. Hall. Is a part of the leadership. Billy is a part of the leadership of Chappell Feeders. You all have grown. You're going to use his name and seeing his name in different contexts. And so he's going to give us a little bit of a brief update. So first, give me an up to speed on kind of you do both the current market and our efforts to protect cattle for this.
Okay. First of all, it's been a privilege for Chappell to be involved with this project, and I think also, being this is the last call, I think that everybody needs to be extremely proud of one another for not just the Simmental juniors, but the Simmental staff and everybody for being involved in this and recognizing the education for the next leaders in our industry. And things like this just have to be done, in my opinion, and we'd like to tip our hat to everybody that's been involved. So basically, the cash market of fat cattle has been a lot stronger than all of us really in the feeding industry would have expected. So last week, the cash cattle in western Nebraska would be 137 to 139, and we were projecting that cash market at this time of the year could be somewhere in the low teens to the way things were going. So from a risk management perspective, we've had a floor in the cattle to protect any downside risk in the market. And I've been coordinating with Chip and everything, and we lifted the call option, so we are not short the market. So basically it cost us very little, but we're able to capture all the upside, the majority of the upside in the fed market. The cattle, there will be the week of May the 8th, there will be 32 head that market. And I apologize, I don't know which cattle's exactly which this evening, but there'll be 32 head the week of 5/8 next week, and there'll be 10 head the week of May the 29th, and there'll be 22 head, which will be the balance the week of June the 5th. So we think the cash market's going to remain fairly strong. These cattle are all going to have the opportunity to make some really good money. And again, it's just been our privilege to be involved and help in any way that we can.
Billy, could I ask one or two quick questions? We have, just so some of these kids could hear your perspective, where is the current health status of those cattle? How have they handled this adjustment into the spring? What's the sense from the folks there at the yard on how those cattle have adjusted to this point?
Yeah, as a whole, everything has been really good. The health on the cattle has been pretty good. Again, as a whole, we did doctor a few cattle upon arrival for the following 30 days, 45 days, revacked them a time or so. The lady that's in charge of overseeing the health for the whole feed yard has done a really good job. But here lately, everything, to my knowledge, has been really good.
Great. And I would certainly echo your sentiments in reverse. And I hope the young folks understand that the commitment from the entire Chappell team, Tom, Trevor, yourself, Sierra, the whole team, it's been above and beyond what we could have asked. I think we've all learned a lot this first time, and we look forward to doing it in the future. Emily, since you're actually in front of the machine, if you have anybody that has comments or questions for Billy, we'll share those now so we can let him go about the rest of his evening. You could let me know that.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything coming through. So if you've got a question for those at the feedlot, be sure you ask it right now. But otherwise, we do thank you, Billy, on behalf of the entire Chappell crew. We're so grateful for everything you guys have done for our program. I know that everyone in the program feels the exact same way. And in case we haven't echoed it enough, Chappell has gone above and beyond this year. And so thank you to everything that you guys have done to secure a great market for our exhibitors. And we're excited to see those come through. So.
Excellent. Okay. You guys have a very good evening. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Billy.
All right. We're going to get then back to the matter at hand. So let's run through this set of slides. So on the screen right now, I think we should be to the Lairage slide. If Emily will make sure we get to that screen. And so Lairage is just the industry terminology for a rest period. And that period, from a packet plant standpoint, is the time when the animals arrive on the truck and they get off the truck and until they're actually moved into the processing facility. This time frame is actually extraordinarily important because we have to monitor a variety of pieces. There are some various incidents that can happen when we stress cattle. The most common in cattle is a phenomenon that we refer to as dark cutters. And so, traditionally speaking, if we stress cattle around the time that they might be loaded, there's probably some anxiety of those cattle, and we can cause a little bit of anxiousness and a stressful feeling. If we can minimize the number of hours that it takes to get those animals to harvest after that loading period, we can greatly diminish the opportunity or the risk of this phenomenon known as dark cutter. We'll see a little bit of that later, so I won't go into much detail, but we really need to keep this to an 8-hour window or less. And so what happens is there are folks who are paid specifically to schedule the travel of the cattle. They know roughly how long it takes to get from a particular yard to the plant, and then they try to coordinate the time that those cattle travel plus the time that they're held in lairage so that they're harvested in that period of time as far under 8 hours as possible. So much longer than that, in particular in heifers or in high-stress steers, we just start to see this phenomenon known as dark cutters. During the lairage period, they are not fed, but they do get ad libitum, which means as much water as they want. Now, once they actually enter the packing plant, into the facility, every plant's designed a little bit different, but those facilities are designed in a way to ease animal flow, to minimize stress, to work with the natural instinct of the animals so that they progress as comfortably and as stress-free into the building as possible. Once they enter the facility, the first step in the harvest process is what we refer to as stunning. As you can see on the screen, that is where we are going to make the animal insensible, or essentially, in layman's terms, it disconnects brain function from the body. And so that is typically done via a tool that we call a captive bolt. All a captive bolt is a long rod fired at a high rate of speed that can either be done ballistically or pneumatically, which means either via essentially a shell like that would come from a gun. It would not fire a bullet, but it would force this bolt forward, or pneumatic, which is air driven. And so what we're trying to do here is to render the animal instantaneously insensible so that it has no ability to feel any pain. And that's crucial because all of these facilities are regulated by the United States government, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, under what is called the Humane Slaughter Act. So these animals have to be rendered instantaneously impervious to pain. So that's the first step. The next step in the process after stunning is a process that we refer to as exsanguination, or again, in layman's terms, bleeding. And this is the process, again, remember, the animal is still alive. It has no brain function at this point in time. It has no ability to feel pain. It is rendered completely insensible, but it is still at this point for a period of time still alive. And the reason this is important is because we use the body's own mechanisms of pumping blood to essentially remove the greatest volume of blood from the carcass. And so through the process of exsanguination, as you can see on the screen, a knife is used to sever the carotid and the jugular artery near the front portion of the brisket. This is usually done in one stroke at an area where those two essentially overlap. And again, the bulk of the blood then is pumped out via the heart, and the animal actually perishes by asphyxiation, or meaning that it loses oxygen to the body because, again, the blood is no longer moving oxygen around. Again, as we move forward to the next slide, at that point then, the animal is going to go through the process of the removal of the hide. And so this is a crucial step, not only because the hide has significant value, so we have to do it carefully, but also this is the greatest opportunity, or one of the two great opportunities for contamination. Obviously, on the outside of the hide, we have mud, manure, fecal matter, various vegetation, and so it is absolutely crucial that the hide is removed with the utmost sanitation. And so this process is monitored extensively by inspectors who monitor every step of the process. We are certainly glossing over some of the more detailed pieces. They monitor a whole variety of steps, various glands, various internal organs, lymph nodes, and the like. But their primary goal at this point in the process is to ensure that fecal matter or manure or vegetation is not allowed to actually get on the carcass. So essentially the initial steps are knives are used to loosen the hide around the legs and around the neck and around the lower portion of the body. And then a mechanism called a hide puller is able to attach to the loose hide near the tail end or the hip end of the calf and remove that hide. And it's a very fast, instantaneous sort of process that can minimize contamination. At this point, then the carcass is still holding on to the internal organs. So the next step in the process is a process that we refer to as evisceration. Evisceration is the technical term for removal of the internal organs. The internal organs, of course, the largest by some margin in a beef animal is the rumen. To give you a sense, if you've not ever had reason to see a rumen or have any understanding of the size and scale of a rumen on a mature beef animal, many of you on this phone call, probably myself included, could get inside of a rumen if we really needed to. It's not something that any of us would choose to do, but that gives you a sense of how large that fermentation tank, more or less, of the stomach is. It's a substantial portion of the stomach. Again, ruminants, as the name implies, have four-chambered stomachs, the rumen being the largest piece. So all portions of the stomach and the intestine are removed, and then we also remove the lungs, the heart, the trachea, and so on. And so those items are all removed along with the remainder of the internal organs. Again, this is the other. I told you there were two major opportunities for contamination. This is the other one. Again, if you rupture an internal organ, that does cause a significant problem, and it causes a tremendous process to follow to clean and sanitize a carcass. So they're very cognizant of that as a package. The next process that you go through with the beef carcass on a harvesting floor is splitting the carcass in half. Doesn't sound very exciting, and I guess in the grand scheme of things, it's fairly simple, but it is something that takes a pretty stout piece of equipment to cut through those vertebrae and to do it uniformly so that both sides weigh essentially the same. If they start to weigh different amounts because they hang together as they go into the cooler, if they get too off-sided or the weight gets too lopsided, they can potentially fall. And that is a dangerous thing because each side of one of these carcasses weighs somewhere in the mid to 400-pound range, and mid to 300 to 400-pound range. And so there's a lot of weight coming down if one of those boards falls. The next step is carcass trimming. And again, as you can read there on the screen, its job is essentially go through and under very serious USDA scrutiny, remove anything that appears to be a contaminant, but also removes items such as bruises or abscesses near the skin. And so we try to get those at that point in time as well. And from an awareness of constant customer safety, there are a variety of processes to sanitize a carcass. The most common process in a major plant is what we would refer to as steam pasteurization. And again, it's not the most complicated process in the world, but it's a crucial process. Those carcasses go through a long tunnel where they are thoroughly engulfed in a steam bath. And so when that steam hits those, you're getting 180 degrees. By the time the steam comes out, that means the water is still at least 180 degrees when it hits the carcass. And essentially all known major contaminants are at that point essentially made null and void when they're hit with 180 degree water for any period of time. The next step then is if all these processes have went without fail under the scrutiny of the USDA, then the carcass will receive a stamp. Every packing facility and every processing facility in the United States has a unique stamp. Every facility has its own establishment number. So you can see here on the screen, here's an example of a USDA stamp. And it very clearly says that this animal was inspected and passed by government personnel, and it lists the establishment number. So that should there be an issue, this USDA stamp will follow this animal all the way through. So when this animal is broken down, when it goes into boxes, when it gets shipped out, this same stamp will be placed on those boxes. So that should there be a problem, there is instant traceability back to that particular plant. I, at one point in time in my life, worked in a packing plant in Amarillo, Texas, that harvests roughly 6,000 steers a day. And it was amazing how many times you saw and became seriously aware of the importance of this stamp and how much our customers relied on that. In particular, when we ship products internationally, this stamp went a long way to giving them the confidence in USD that is so pervasive throughout our industry. Now, what happens is everything we've seen to this point takes place on what is typically referred to as the kill floor. Animals are harvested and they are stamped. Then they will go into a process that allows them to chill down for the carcass to cool. And sometimes even this process includes a step of electrical stunning that enhances this process. But for the most part, they go into a large cooler and they're allowed to sit for anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. Following that process, they come out and they are run past what is called a grade scale. And in the grading system, there are two approaches to grading. One, you can have a visual inspection by a USDA grader who's trained for this process. And more, the second version is becoming more and more common, and that's where we use instrument grading. And instrument grading, as the name implies, is done by a set of cameras that can capture these pictures of some of the things that are relevant to evaluate the carcass, and then the stamp is on the screen on the carcass. And so on the left example of a yield grade stamp, where it says USDA number 1, that would denote a yield grade 1 stamp, meaning the leanest version of a carcass. Those go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 5 to that. And on the right side, you see the various forms of quality grade stamps. The USDA Prime, which is the highest version in the United States. Again, somewhere in the ballpark of 3 to 4% right now in the industry get that grade. Choice being the one that you see most frequently at top-end steakhouses and grocers that you might visit. Select, Standard. Select still is found in many grocery stores, but Select and Standard have more institutional work, and the others typically denote older females and go into further processed products. This is essentially what that carcass will be broken down into. These are the major wholesale cuts, and they are broken down into the following. The main cuts that we typically think of that add significant value are the chuck, the rib, the loin, and the round. However, the other cuts also carry significant weight. For example, one of those is the brisket. As you all know, this time of year, that is a very hot commodity and has tremendous value. And so those are the wholesales, and each of those can be broken down farther. The most valuable cuts in general come from what we call the middle meat. Those muscles that are not normally exercised in a four-legged animal, they typically support along the back. And those most valuable cuts, or those middle meats, typically come from the rib and the loin. And from the rib and the loin, we would find a combination of products that you would be familiar with: prime rib, ribeye steak, T-bones, porterhouse, tenderloins, or fillets. And so that's where those high-end steaks typically come from. Those products that come from the chuck and the round tend to be much more exercised. They're much more involved in locomotion because the animal moves around. And so a lot of those muscles are used in different cooking methods that require them to be to get a bit more of a moist cooking method, or they're ground up and used in ground products such as hamburger or the like. And so that is the basic process of the walkthrough of a packing plant. Next, Emily is going to put up on the screen for us, I think, our next set of slides, which is how do we grade those carcasses, and what are the specifics, kind of breaking down that category just a little bit more. So, Emily, I'm going to let you, if you have questions, you're just going to have to tell me. If not, you just tell me when you have the other set of slides done.
Okay, no questions yet, so keep on rolling.
Okay. And so, again, we're going to flow into the quality and yield grading process. So we're going to go into that second slide. It's some things that we need to be familiar with, some terminologies that are quite important in our industry. Branded beef. Branded is typically just a trade lingo for beef that carries a company name with it, not just marketed as choice beef or select beef, but carries a brand with it. And so you're familiar with some of those. And so that's sign of quality grade. It tends to denote an animal that is much tougher and much less palatable, or much less friendly during the eating experience, as it were. And so no roll is the trade name, it's the trade lingo for the standard grade. The reason for that is a standard actually typically, historically speaking, would not get a stamp rolled on it, so that's how it developed the trade name, no roll. There is, of course, the ongoing conversation between organic and natural, and we're not going to go into that necessarily this evening, other than there are certain rules that govern those and certain rules that are necessary to have in place to be able to utilize those terminologies. They attempt to denote animals that, for one reason or another, in the case of organic, that are never at any level have the potential to get any sort of GMO-type product. In most cases, those programs also denote the fact that they cannot ever have had the opportunity to potentially consume any sort of animal protein. Natural is similar, but there are certainly some subtle differences. There's grass-fed versus grain-fed beef, and I would gather that most of us on this call are familiar with what that means. Your cattle are all grain-fed as they come through a feed yard. There certainly is the capability of grass-feeding cattle. It is difficult in most parts of the United States. Our growing season often isn't long enough to actually match enough grass with cattle, but there are some who do that. The drawbacks of grass-fed beef, they tend to have a much lower marbling score, so their quality grades or their eating quality and their flavor profile tend to be distinctly different. Bullock, that is the terminology for either a very old cut animal, when that grades, and you can tell those carcasses, they just look very lean and lack a lot of fat. And then veal is a very young beef, and we typically do not include them in the discussion as beef cattle. They have their own qualification, and they're animals that are quite young. Very frequently, they come out of the dairy industry. They are males out of that industry. So I mentioned earlier that there are some major pieces, some major wholesale or primals that come out of a beef carcass. And again, this slide denotes those. And in the middle, you see that there is a delineation where we split a carcass. So I told you earlier that on the harvesting floor, on the quote-unquote kill floor, these carcasses are split in half from top to bottom, or front to rear. But again, because of the size of a beef carcass, and so that it can be graded, it is split again across itself between the 12th and the 13th rib. And that's what separates what we call the forequarter, which contains the chuck and the rib and the brisket, from the hindquarter, which is predominantly the loin and the rack. Again, reference quickly those quality grades. You can see them here in order from the highest or the most desirable quality grade as being prime to the lowest in commercial, utility, and cutter. And those bottom three, again, tend to get made into further processed items, maybe some of your hot pockets or soups or stews or ground products. The quality grade is our best delineation at this point of eating quality. And so that's why it's so important that we try to give the consumer an idea of what they can expect from their purchase. Now, as you can imagine, there are different price points. The higher you get on the scale, the closer you get to choice and time, the higher dollar figure that you're going to pay for this particular product. Now, you all should know that quality grade, what we call quality grade, is made up of two very important factors. One is maturity. Maturity is essentially how old is that animal. And it's not really how old is it by calendar, but it's how old is it physiologically, meaning how old does it look or feel. As you all know, if we go to school, there are some folks who are 12 years old who look like they could be 8, and some who are 12 years old who look like they could be 16. And so, and cattle are not any different. They can have physiological age that's different. And the primary way we determine that is by bone work, and we can discuss that briefly. But for our purposes, all of our cattle are young cattle, and so for the most part, marbling is the more important piece. And remember, marbling determines what we refer to as intramuscular fat, or the fat that's inside of this really important muscle that we talk about a lot, which the scientific name is the longissimus dorsi muscle, but this is the big muscle that makes up both your ribeye steak and the big side of a T-bone, or the muscle that makes up a strip steak. And so that is what we looked at. There are a different kind of fat, and we don't want to confuse those. Intermuscular, TER, is the muscle that's outside of that is outside of that muscle. Intra is the one that determines marbling and hence quality grade. Here is a picture of some different marbling scores. And because marbling is such an important piece of quality grade, this is crucial. All USDA graders, and of course any of the machines that do this, they're very aware of these pictures. And you can see as you go from the top where it says moderately abundant and slightly abundant down to the bottom, you can see a distinct difference in the amount of fat that fills that longissimus dorsi muscle. So the biggest reason for fat, let's just be honest and clear. The primary reason that we want fat in a steak is it acts somewhat as an insurance policy. Fat does not make a piece of meat more tender, but it can make your mouth feel and think that a piece of meat is more tender, because fat is really just oil. And so in the same way that you use oil to lube different parts of your tractors or your truck, in the same way, or if you've seen cattle ultrasounded and use oil there, fat becomes oil once it gets in your mouth. And so it lubricates your mouth and can make you think that a piece of meat is tender. And so the tenderness issue is actually independent, but as long as your mouth feels like it's tender, that's a bonus. And so restaurateurs, those who own fancy restaurants and the like, one of the reasons that they will invest in steaks with higher marbling scores and higher quality grades is because when you or someone else orders that piece of meat and starts to bite into it, there is a much lower risk of you returning that steak as something you do not like if there's a greater amount of fat in it, because again, even if the steak wasn't tender, your mouth may get tricked to think that it is. So fat is, in a weird way, a bit of an insurance policy. When you look on these slides, when you look up at the top, those that say moderately abundant and slightly abundant, those two pictures are actually connected to the grade that we call prime. When you get that much fat, then you get up into the prime grade. Then there's a picture that's called moderate and another one called modest. Those would be pictures of carcasses of the base thresholds for a couple categories that make up the top 2/3 of choice, or oftentimes where some of what we call the premium programs lie. To give you a sense, you've heard the trade name Certified Angus Beef. Certified Angus Beef comes from those two categories, modest and moderate. Then when we go down, small is the base level of choice. A cat has to have at least that much fat in its ribeye for it to be able to grade choice. Slight is the picture denoted on the bottom right, and that's what looks like for those that have the select grade. And you can see that picture, even though it's probably a little hard for you to see, has almost no fat flecks in it at all. And so that tells you if we were to get below that, they would essentially be devoid of fat and be much older. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail on the maturity process, but I do want you to see, because quality grade is made up of both maturity and marbling, there is actually a system in place to look at maturity. Most of it comes from the processes off the vertebra along the back of the animal. So the USDA grader looks, and if you can see on the very tip of these, there's some very white pieces, and those are cartilage buttons. The more cartilage there is, just like in you, each of you on this phone call that's listening to me has a lot more cartilage left in your skeleton and in your spinal processes than I do. What's that mean? That means you're still growing. That means means you're more flexible. That means if you and I go out ice skating and you fall on your tailbone, it's likely to hurt you less than it's going to hurt me, because my cartilage buttons have ossified and turned into bone. As a result, my skeleton is much more rigid. And so you can see it's the same process here. This is how we determine physiological maturity in a beef part. And you can see that for the most part, cattle with A maturity carcasses are 30 months or younger. That'll certainly catch all of y'all's. So this gives you a little bit more in depth. It looks at color and texture. I don't want to beat that horse too hard tonight just from an interest of time, but I do encourage you to go back and look at it. But here's maybe a better representation if we go to the next slide where it goes to beef color standard, Emily. If we're not there, that's where we need to be. And if you look at these, you can see these are a very robust set of colors. And they give you a sense of the range in colors. And just like many of you on here probably have went deer hunting at one point or another. And if you've got that massive old buck who had a rack on him that you were super excited to put all over Facebook and call Grandma and Grandpa about, when you cut into him, because of his age and some physiological phenomenon, his muscle gets much darker and looks much more like the pictures on the far right. However, if you were deer hunting and maybe inadvertently harvested a deer who was a lot younger than maybe you had anticipated you would harvest during that hunting season, that muscle tends to be much lighter colored, much more to the left. Ideally, beef is going to be more of a cherry red color, more like what you see in pictures 3 and 4. That's the most ideal version of beef color for us to see. Recognize when these muscle tissues are not exposed to oxygen, remember, they are not red. It's when they're opened up and the air hits them, they actually start to turn to red. So here's how this quality grade comes together. We have the maturity across the top. And again, in our situation, our cattle are A maturity. And then across the left, we have these marbling scores, and we intersect. And wherever they intersect, that's the quality grade of your animal. Our hope for each and every one of you is that your animals fall somewhere from A small, which would be low choice, and higher. To be clear, select has only one box on this screen, and that's where A maturity hits slight marbling. The next screen, we're going to transition over to the concept of yield grade. Quality grade and yield grade are like flip sides of the same coin. One side helps us determine how much product is there. The other side helps us determine how palatable or how good to consume that product is. Yield grade is the side that helps us determine how much is there. And so the technical term for yield grade is it's an estimation of the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cut from the rib, loin, chuck, and round. 1 being the leanest, 5 being the fattest. If you don't take anything else away from this slide, I want you to remember the following. If somebody tells you or asks you how much beef is there in a beef animal, well, if you look on the USDA yield grade numbers, look at number 3. Number 3 tells you that a yield grade 3, you can expect roughly 47.8 to 50% retail product out of that carcass. So, hypothetically speaking, if you had a steer and he weighed 1,000 pounds, that would be small, but just for easy math. If you had a steer that weighed 1,000 pounds, his dressing percent, or how much animal actually got hung on the rail, how heavy his carcass was, would be about 63%. So let's just say your carcass weighs about 630 pounds from your 1,000-pound steer. On a yield grade 3, roughly half of that 630 pounds is retail product. So that 1,000-pound steer ought to transition down to about 310 or 315 pounds of retail product if he's a yield grade 3. It's slightly better for a yield grade 1, somewhat worse for a yield grade 5. On the next screen, we see the factors that influence yield grade. For some of you who are a little younger, I apologize if this looks like a bit much as we get on this screen, but it's really relatively simple. The factors that affect yield grade are HCW, hot carcass weight. Also, how much muscle do you have? That is the REA, or ribeye area. How fat are you? Back fat, the BF or the FT that you see towards the bottom. And the only thing that might be a little peculiar to you is the terminology KPH, or kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. And what that is internal fat that typically protects internal organs. Those are the factors that help us determine how lean or the yield grade of a particular carcass. Here's some pictures. Here's an example. This is kidney and pelvic fat. You can't actually see the heart fat. Well, you can actually. It's toward the bottom. It's just not circled. It's got an H near it. But those are fat deposits that form very early in an animal's life. They form that way in you and me as well. And they protect those internal organs. There's not a huge variation in KPH, but it does exist. Back fat. We measure back fat. You can see there's kind of a black mark on the screen on this next slide. We're on 13, by the way, Ms. Emily. And there's a black mark about 3/4 of the way down across the top. And what this is you come off of that midline of the animal and down that rib face at that 12th, 13th rib that I spoke about earlier, and you measure the fat depth about 3/4 of the way down that ribeye. And that gives you the back fat that we get. This is how you could calculate muscle mass or the ribeye area. There are a couple different approaches, but the most common approach is using a grid. This is not meant to teach you how to do that, but some of you will definitely see this again in your future at the promise. So this is the yield grade equation for those who would want to be able to calculate yield grade. To be clear, we are using the yield grade equation on the left. The one on the right, that's for folks working in a plant. You can disregard that for the sake of this conversation. But you can see we would take a base of 2.5, then we would add to that an adjustment where we take 2.5 times the back fat of your animal, plus an adjustment to KPH where we multiply your KPH times 0.2, plus an adjustment for hot carcass weight, where we take 0.0038 times your hot carcass weight of your calf, and then we subtract ribeye area and its adjustment of 0.32. When we add all that together, and it's a pretty simple math equation, that gives us yield grade. Now, for those of you who are interested and get excited about this piece, I'd encourage you to come back to this slide later. Here's some sample problems, or here is a sample problem. You can walk through and see if you can do that and get a similar answer to what's on the screen. Remember, on yield grade, a yield grade 1 or a yield grade 1.9, they're both still a yield grade 1. A yield grade 3.1 or a yield grade 3.8, they're still both yield grade 3. Now, in the present industry, we do divide those up to some extent. Many cases and many grids, we may divide yield grade 2s in half to a 2 and to a 2.0 to a 2.49, or a 2.5 to a 2.99. We can do the same thing with the yield grade 3 and so on. Yield grade 4s and 5s are where the significant discounts start to step in. Here on slide 17, Emily, we're on the pricing slide, and this gives you just a little sense of how we put those things into place. So now we've determined the quality grade on your calf through its maturity and its marbling. We've looked at the various factors we just spoke about to determine a yield grade. Now, why are those important? Because those are what determine how you get paid. Those come together on some sort of grid, and you get bonuses or premiums for animals who are leaner, being yield grade 1s or 2s, and you get discounts for animals that are fatter, meaning yield grade 4s and 5s. And at the same time, you get premiums for quality grades that are higher, meaning prime, premium choice, and you get discounts for those that are lower, select, no roll, and so forth. So as you see on the slide, it gives you just a very simple graphic of which animals tend to be worth the most money. If you could consistently make prime yield grade 1, you'd be making a fortune. The problem is, and the reality is, those are darn difficult to make. Making prime 3s is much easier. Making choice 2s and 3s, much easier. And so those star figures or the minuses kind of reflect the value of each of those categories. On the next slide, we see a slightly more realistic grid. It's got numbers actually plugged into it. And you could see how, in this case, this is an example of a Simmental grid with Swift. It's a 70-70 grid, meaning that people get premiums if animals get 70% choice and 70% in the superior yield grade. And so you can see, if you look on this slide, if you go towards the right side under the choice column, and you go down 3 spots, you see where it says base. That means that they are assuming that your animal will be a choice yield grade 3. If your animal, in this particular example, by the way, is a choice yield grade 3, you get neither a premium nor a discount. However, if you look straight to the left, you see if your animal was a select 3, in the very next column to the left, you would see that animal is going to lose 10 cents a pound or $10 per 100, hence the -10. Now, if we go the other way, up and down instead of left and right, if your animal's choice, so it's back to that base, but instead of being a yield grade 3, maybe it's leaner than the normal, and it's a yield grade 2, so I go up 1 row, that animal is actually going to get a $3.50 per 100 premium or bump. Conversely, if I go down, if that animal got too fat on us while we were feeding it, and it's a yield grade 4 and its choice, it's going to lose $12 per 100 or 12 cents per pound. So here's the struggle. You might say, well, let's just always feed him to choice 3. This is cake. The problem is it's much more difficult to predict. And so in our effort to get enough quality grade in them, to get them choice or even on occasion prime, sometimes we can feed them too long and get them just a little bit too fat, and we risk getting down in the yield grade 4 or even on rare occasions the yield grade 5 category. And so that is the struggle that our friends at Chappell have been going through for us, and that's why they've gone through the ultrasound process and they watch things really close to see when it's time to market those cattle. And that's also why some of these cattle are marketing in different groups. They feel like the first group of cattle is better set up right now to have a chance to hit that combination of quality grade and yield grade, and the other cattle probably need a little bit more time to ensure that they have a chance to get enough quality grade to get up towards choice. You can see on this slide, and I referenced it earlier, on the next picture though, on slide 19, I referenced the term dark cutter. And you can see on the right, here is an example of what a dark cutter looks like. And what happens is dark cutters, as the name implies, cause a piece of meat to turn very dark. In fact, it can be anywhere from extremely dark red to purple to almost just jet black. Now, what causes this is a higher pH that starts prior to life, and some of those stress issues that we spoke about. But what this pH does is it causes this carcass to actually retain a lot of water. In some ways, that's a very good thing. That means when you cook that piece of meat, it has the potential to maintain a lot of moisture, to be very moist when you cook it. The problem is that if it sits on a customer shelf or a retailer shelf very long, the more water there is in a muscle, the greater chance there is for microbial growth or bacterial problems. So it has the chance to go bad faster. So in and of itself, it's not a terrible thing, but it does have the chance to cause a problem. But the biggest issue, frankly, is if I have a piece of meat that's black in your local grocery store, guess what? Nobody's buying it. And so dark cutters, as you saw in the previous slide, typically are discounted significant dollars, usually $25 per 100 or more. Again, another strong reason to choose against cattle that are high stress. Now, in these following slides, I'm going to save some of them for you all to look at a little bit more closely later. But what they are some examples of some visuals. And Emily, if you would just kind of scan slowly through on slide 20, it asks kind of just a big generic question. And the next few slides help you kind of look at some things. So on slide 21, you can see a distinct difference in fat. You can see that the red calf has a lot more fat down in its brisket, in the lower 1/3 of its body, over its rib cage. It looks much more like the traditional feedlot steer than the one up in the picture called number 1. On slide 22, you see a contrast in muscling. That same black steer up at the top, but now we have kind of a brown tinged calf. And if you study that calf in the base of its hip, in a number of indicator traits, indicator areas that you all know well, many of you are certainly livestock judges in your local 4-H or FFA program, you can see that the brown calf or the chocolate calf gets much flatter in her muscle makeup. Now, as we would roll down to slide 23, here's a nice example of that same red Angus steer that we saw from a couple pictures ago. And here's a picture of him alive and a picture of his carcass. And here are his statistics on the left. And so what we see here is a calf, you can see from the picture on the right, got pretty fat, has a back fat of 0.9 or nearly an inch. Has a ribeye that's decent in terms of size, probably a little bit small for his weight, however. You see his hot carcass weight, and you see all the tools you would need to calculate both his yield grade and his quality grade. And so his quality grade comes out to be a low choice, and his yield grade is a 4. And so that calf, if we went back to our earlier slide, you would see that he would face a pretty significant discount for that yield grade 4. So in this calf's case, it's nice that we got him to the choice grade. We've probably been better served shipping him a little bit earlier, and maybe even taking the discount for a select to avoid the yield grade 4. And on top of this, just to kind of wrap all this up and put in some context, every day he's on feed, it costs me money, right? You all know by now, you pay yardage fees. If you own a lot of cattle, you may have borrowed money from a bank, so you're paying interest rates. And so we really are sensitive to overfeeding of cattle and the costs associated with that. On the next slide, on slide 24, we see a Baldy steer, one who certainly maybe could have some Simmental influence. And you see this calf is a lot leaner. This calf's yield grade is 3.5, again, pretty much normal in the industry. Calf weighs essentially 1,200 pounds and is mid-range choice. That means this calf being black, and from best we can tell, does not have any horns. And so this calf, even though he's likely has some Simmental blood in him, or maybe some Hereford blood in him, this calf would qualify for certified Angus beef because he is lean enough, he's high enough in the choice grade, and so that gives you a kind of a sense of some of the various branded programs out there. This calf's in a pretty good spot relative to the grid of being just a little bit more valuable than that base calf because he goes up in quality grade just a little bit. On slide 25, we certainly have some folks with us who are more from the southeast, in the south. Here we have a picture of a Brayford steer that many of you probably wouldn't see very often. A Brayford is as the name implies, is a Brahman Hereford mix, and there are certain things we would expect about that breed composition, and this animal holds true. This calf's quite a little bit leaner than the others we've seen, and has a pretty big top in him. He has a big ribeye of 16.6 inches, and that's pretty good, especially for his weight. But you can see his quality grade is SE plus or Select plus, and so that means he did not grade choice, and he's a yield grade 1. And so if you went back, you would be able to guess and see what his price point would be on that grid that we had earlier. In our last calf that we're going to look at, again, another calf is probably more indicative of the South, is a Brangus steer, one that is yield grade 3.0. His quality grade is also Select, and so again, he would be facing a discount for his quality grade. So that's a lot of rambling and a lot of stuff to cover really fast, but I wanted to get this in front of you so that you could go back and look at it slowly and discuss it with yourselves at home or ask us questions. And here's a set of questions you could ask your own self, and you can figure those things out as you play with the grid. So with that, we're flirting with an hour, so I'm going to be quiet. And Emily, if you have questions, throw them at me.
Awesome. Well, it looks like everybody's being kind of quiet tonight. So if you've got questions, send them over or chat them to me, or of course, you feel free to text me. The only question that we've had so far, which hopefully I've got right, is where are the steers going to be harvested?
Yes, they will be harvested at Fort Morgan, at a Cargill plant, Fort Morgan, Colorado, and that is a Cargill plant. And so all three groups will go to that same facility. So all of the processing impacts on the calves will be exactly the same across the three groups, even though they're harvested on different dates.
Awesome. And then I know several of you heard when Billy was on talk about the 3 different groups that are being sent to the plant. All of the data that you received a couple of weeks ago, I know we talked about that at the last call, breaks those out into what group your steer is going to be harvested in. So if you've got questions, go back to that email that I sent you a couple of weeks ago. So otherwise, guys, it sure doesn't look like anybody's got any questions. From a wrap-up standpoint, I just want you all to recall the steers will be shipping out here in the next 2 to 4 weeks, depending on their size, and you should be receiving your checks to you. Just as soon as we get them, we'll turn around and send them to you guys if they don't come direct to you from the plant. We will be tabulating all of your profitability results, and those awards will be given at the National Classic Banquet in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. It is July 14th, Friday, July 14th. I believe the banquet's at 6 p.m. And so if anybody wants to join, we'd love to have you there. Of course, you can purchase your tickets online at juniorsimmental.org. Chip, while you're on, we've got a quick question that just came in. What grid will the steers be sold on? Do you know?
That is a great question, and again, as you've probably gathered, I am not in my office. I'm driving, and I don't want to swear to you without having that in front of me. What I can do is I can get that confirmation, and I can have that sent to each of the members, each of those of you involved, so you know what the grid is that you're getting paid on. I have been informed, but sadly, I apologize. I do not have that in front of me. But we can get that to you in good order.
Okay. Awesome. Well, it doesn't look like there's any other questions, guys. From everyone on behalf of the American Simmental Association, if this is the last time that we get to touch base with you, thank you so much for participating in our inaugural year. I know it's been a bit of a bumpy road at some points. Everybody has been learning along the way. We're excited that we're going to be launching our 2nd year. Of course, we hope that you've been retaining your springborn calves. Our entry deadline is going to be September 15th this year. And so hopefully this year we'll have it a little bit more automated. We'll know a little bit more what to expect going into year 2. But thank you so much to everyone who's joined up until this point. We're grateful that you've been involved, and we're excited to have you back next year. So until then, we hope to see you in Mississippi.